Starting us off at number 10 is John Justin Bunting. Known as the ringleader for the infamous Snowtown killings, Bunting is responsible for the death of 11 people in South Australia between 1992 and 1999. John Justin Bunting was a troubled man known to have an intense hatred for homosexuals as well as people interested in minors. And while I think we can all agree that it's understandable he hated those interested in minors, the problem is that he never had any proof that his victims were criminals of such things and would just assume they were because they were also gay. Most of his victims were either friends, roommates, or relatives, and along with his 3 other conspirators, he would kidnap the victims, then torture them in various sick ways before taking their lives. The case was uncovered when the remains of 8 people were found in barrels of acid in Snowtown, Australia. Then 3 days later, 2 more victims were found buried in a backyard. Allegedly, their final victim was fried and eaten by Bunting and his gang. After a series of trials, Bunting was ultimately declared the ringleader and was sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. The others faced similar charges, each serving 1 life sentence per charge, and these monsters will thankfully be locked up until their last days. Next up at number 9, Andre Thomas. Early on in life, Andre was unfortunately very badly abused by his mother and began to experience crushing auditory hallucinations at the age of 10. Then in 1999, while in grade 9, he met Laura, who soon became pregnant and brought Andre Jr. into the world later that year. Now with a son, Andre decided to drop out of high school and get a job to support his family, and by the age of 18, he and Laura finally married. The marriage, however, was short-lived, as Laura quickly caught on to the realities of his mental health issues and separated from Andre 4 months later. Tragically, however, the separation took a devastating toll on Andre's not yet diagnosed condition, which began convincing him that Laura was Jezebel and Andre Jr. was the Antichrist, and that he had to kill them. Finally, in March of 2004, Andre broke into her apartment and killed the entire family, each with a separate blade, as he claimed he did not want to contaminate their blood and allow the demons inside of them to live. After the incident, he attempted to take his own life. However, when that didn't go to plan, he removed one of his eyes instead. Eventually, after a long trial, he was sentenced to death for his crimes until 3 years later when he removed his remaining eye and ingested it. While his sentence did not change officially, this incident catapulted Andre to be relocated to a psych ward, as he was eventually seen as not adequately fit to be executed. Coming in at number 8, the Icebox Killer. On June 2nd, 1991, 23-year-old Denise attended a concert in LA and began making her way home to Orange County around 2 a.m. However, the next morning, when her parents, who she lived with, woke to find she wasn't there, they called police to make sure she hadn't been in an accident or hurt somehow. But all that was found was Denise's car on the side of a freeway with a drained battery, and for 3 years, no one had any clue where she was. That was until July of 1994, when a woman arrived at the house of a man named John Femerello to purchase some paint. While there, she saw what appeared to be a very old rental car in her driveway, and after getting a strange feeling about him, she reached out to authorities, who determined the car was stolen. Still not connecting the 2 incidents, a police officer arrived on site to speak to John about the stolen vehicle. But when he arrived, he noticed an electrical cord running to a freezer from the back of the truck. Initially believing he was running some kind of lab, the deputy reached out to a locksmith to open the back of the truck, but to his horror, the body of a young, beaten, and tortured woman was inside, who was later determined to be the missing woman, Denise Huber. And tragically, after investigating the property, it became evident she had likely not been his only victim. John was convicted and sentenced to death in 1997 and remains locked up in California awaiting his fate. Coming in at number 7, the Pig Farmer Killer. Robert William Picton, or Willie, is a Canadian pig farmer responsible for killing 49 women between 1982 to 2002. Willie was known to be a fairly quiet and simple guy by his friends and family, and after his parents' death took over the family farm in 1980. But once he was in charge of the farm, he would soon become a monster. While it's not known exactly the detail of each crime, it's believed he would engage with escorts and then in the middle of, well, you know, would get extremely angry and blame them for thefts or crimes. The situation would escalate and he would ultimately handcuff the victims before attacking them and take their lives. But the creepiest part is that from there, he would take the bodies of his victims and put them through a wood chipper before feeding it to his pigs. And it's believed that some of the resulting bits would get mixed in with pork mince and sold to friends and family. Upon his 2002 arrest for his crimes, Willie admitted to all accounts and was even disappointed as he was trying to round out his tally to an even 50 prior to being caught. Willie was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for at least 25 years, although it seems highly unlikely they are ever going to let him leave. Coming in at number 6, Randy Stephen Kraft. Between 1972 to 1983, Randy Stephen Kraft became known as the Scorecard Killer after being found responsible for the death of 16 young men in California. However, although only convicted of 16 victims, it's believed he harmed, tortured, and killed up to 67 men in the area. After high school graduation in 1963, Randy's plan was to become a US Senator, and so he enrolled in college for economics. However, through his college years, he began to distance himself from his previous dreams and started drinking, partying, and getting himself into trouble. After just barely graduating, Randy joined the US Air Force and rose to Airman First Class. However, by 1969, he was discharged after the Army discovered he was gay. Around this same time, Kraft became distant from his family as they did not really approve of his sexuality either, and by 1970, he committed his first known essay on a boy. The following years, Kraft became obsessed and would lure young men, often of military background, to his van, then and take advantage of them before torturing their bodies until death and dumping them along the nearest freeway. This pattern repeated for over 10 years until he was finally caught and sentenced to death, where he now remains locked up awaiting his inevitable fate. Next up at number 5, BTK. To the public and his community, he was a totally normal, polite, and well-mannered man. Rader was an active member of his church and was actually elected president of the church council and even volunteered as a Cub Scout leader. He had a wife and kids who would describe him as a totally average and nice guy. But Rader had a dark secret that would soon change everything. Despite his outward persona, he was actually a truly disturbed man and was into some pretty terrifying things in the bedroom that eventually leaked their way into his crimes. To start off, I'll give you a hint. BTK is an abbreviation that stands for Bind, Torture, Kill. And it was disturbing things along those lines that he liked to do to, as he put it, trapped and helpless women. But if a woman wasn't available, he would take pictures of himself in women's clothing wearing a mask of a woman's face and bind himself as he seemed to enjoy living out a fantasy as his own victims. Between 1974 to 1991, Dennis Rader killed 10 women in Wichita, Kansas, and was known to send taunting letters to the authorities and media describing his crimes in gruesome detail. There was then a strange hiatus in his crimes for about 10 years, but thankfully this creep was arrested in 2005 and is currently serving 10 consecutive life sentences, one for each woman he killed. Coming in at number 4, George Emil Banks. Despite having a previous criminal record for an armed offense, Banks managed to get a job as a correctional officer in 1980. However, in 1982, Banks began worrying coworkers after he kept saying things like a race war would soon consume the world and that he wanted to protect his sons and daughters from the torment and agony of racism. Then, after a conflict with a supervisor, he was put on extended leave from the prison and ordered to be examined for mental health issues. Not long after his mandated leave from work, Banks, having consumed massive amounts of and alcohol, tragically killed 13 people, 9 of which were his own family members, 3 former in-laws, and 1 bystander. Unbeknownst to Banks, his former brother-in-law was able to survive by hiding in the closet and called police to identify the attacker as Banks. Eventually, police were able to track him down at a friend's house, and after a 4-hour standoff, they were able to draw him out. During the trial, Banks explained his crimes by saying he did not want his offspring to be victimized in a race war, as he had suffered from racism much of his life as a biracial man. This explanation, however, did not sway the jury, and he was convicted to life in prison, where he remains to this day. Coming in at number 3, Joseph Fritzl. One of the most heartbreaking cases I have ever read about is the case of Joseph Fritzl. Born in 1935 in Austria, at 21 he married a girl named Rosemary, and the pair had a family of 7 together. Now, he was a very abusive man to everyone in his family, but especially Elizabeth. However, the peak of his cruelty began when Elizabeth was 18 and he lured her into the basement, where he trapped her for the next 24 years. In those 24 years, he assaulted her constantly, and during her imprisonment, she gave birth to 7 people. Of course, over the years, many were concerned about Elizabeth's disappearance, but Fritzl would lie and say that she ran off to join a cult, and that he had no clue where she was. One day, after one of Elizabeth's offspring was ill, she managed to convince him to take her to the hospital, and once they arrived, police were on site to detain them. After making sure she would never be forced to see her father again, Elizabeth told authorities everything that her father ever did to her and her little ones, and Fritzl was sentenced to life for his crimes. Coming in at number 2, Gary Ridgway. Gary grew up in a troubled household with very little stability, which led to him wetting the bed well into his teen years. However, after each incident, his mother would clean him up, leading Gary to have conflicting feelings of both anger and desire towards his mother, often fantasizing about killing her and doing unspeakable things to her corpse. When he got older, he joined the military, and it was during his time in combat that he became obsessed with escorts. Once he returned back to America, his first marriage ended quickly after his wife discovered he had given her multiple infections. Soon after, he married again, this time finding salvation in the church. He forced his wife into a staunch and devout life, but in contrast, kept his ravenous appetite for inappropriate relations with those whose company he paid for. But Ridgway had an inner conflict about his desires, and so he started strangling the women after he had got what he wanted from them, dumping their brutalized bodies into the woods. Disgustingly, it was later revealed by one of his wives that he would often ask to have relations in the woods. At the time, she didn't know why, but during investigations, multiple of his victims were found buried in those woods, and authorities believe he got pleasure from being in the area. Upon his arrest, he was officially convicted for taking 49 lives, but during trial, he famously said he had killed so many that he lost count, and that he didn't even know the real number anymore. Last up in our number 1 spot, Edmund Kemper. One of the most notorious killers of the 20th century, early on, Kemper showed signs of strange behavior. It started out with torturing insects, but by age 10, he buried his pet cat alive, waited for it to die, then dug it up, decapitated it, and mounted its head on a spike. From there, things only got more concerning. By the age of 13, his parents divorced and his mother became his sole parental figure. However, she was an abusive alcoholic who mocked and humiliated the boy, and so their relationship turned into an extremely toxic one. At 14, Kemper ran away from home to try and be with his father, but eventually ended up living with his grandparents, and that is where things got really bad. At age 15, he killed killed both his grandparents and was arrested for the crimes. However, due to his age, he didn't face any criminal charges. By 1969, on his 21st birthday, he was released on parole against his psychologist's warning and sent to live with his mother. Kemper, however, hated his mother, and the two fought non-stop. By 1972, he began seeking out college student victims after a fight with his mother, and by 1973, he had taken the lives of 8 different women this way, becoming known in the public as the co-ed killer. Finally, in April of 1973, he bludgeoned his mother in her sleep before doing awful, unspeakable things to her decapitated head, and then called over her best friend and killed her too before turning himself in. In the end, Kemper was sentenced to life in prison despite his request to be tortured to death, and will remain behind bars until his final day.
Number 10. Lionel Tate. Starting off our list, we have Lionel Tate. It was 2001 and Lionel was play fighting with another friend, so he says. She was actually a neighbor, and at just 13 years old, Lionel did something that day that made him one of the youngest criminals in history to ever receive a life sentence. He was 13 years old. He was barely a teenager. He had to receive a life sentence because he had taken these pro wrestling moves, as he calls them, too far. He had told authorities it was an accident, but it was very clear that she had been attacked brutally. It was awful. Her wounds were sadly fateful, which of course led to the life sentence of one Lionel Tate. Now, in 2010, it was ruled unconstitutional for teens to receive life sentences unless it was murder. This is obviously cause for debate. Number 9. Brian Lee Draper. This one's actually 2 criminals for the price of none. Brian Lee Draper and his partner, Tori Adamick, both were sentenced to life at just 16 years old. It was disgusting and vile to say the least. They both planned this horrific attack. They hid in their classmate's closet and then they both violently attacked her. She had 29 stab wounds. Cassie Jo Stoddard was killed because 2 16-year-olds hid in her house and then cut the power. That's terrifying. I cannot imagine how scary that must have been. Reminder, both of them are serving life sentences. It doesn't feel like enough almost, you know what I mean? Like, you read about her injuries and what happened and the whole incident. 1 life sentence doesn't feel like enough in this case, so I get it. A lot of these cases, people get 6 life sentences. I'm like, yep, more than fair. Number 8, Eric Smith. We go back now to 1993. I wasn't even born yet, but Eric Smith, he was 13 years old and he couldn't contain his rage towards another youngin'. Now, Eric himself was bullied growing up, he didn't get along with anybody, and one day he decided to attack somebody violently with a rock. He had lured them into the woods first away from the park, and then just like that, that was it. Smith is of course a lot older now, and in total he's been denied parole 8 times. Yeah, probably 9 by the time this video goes out, realistically. I hope he never gets out. I don't know, this is something I don't think you can bounce back from, to be honest with you. That's some Michael Myers if I'm being honest. Number 7, Kenneth Young. His last name is literally Young. It's quite ironic and also extremely brutal, this one. Young was 15 years old and he was faced with a situation that nobody should have to face, let alone face it at such an early age. Kenneth Young was threatened by a narcotics dealer. He forced Kenneth to partake in his illegal dealings, specifically that of an armed robbery, or else he would take Kenneth's mother and he would hurt her. Now, Kenneth did what he was asked, rather did what he was forced to do, but one night when said dealer was assaulting a woman, Kenneth attacked the dealer, and in turn he received 4 concurrent sentences of 30 years. Now, the dealer in question, he was 24 and he forced Kenneth to be involved in 3 armed robberies and 1 attempted armed robbery, all in a 30-day period. That dealer only received a single life sentence. Yeah, not all of these are the best judgments, I would say. Number 6, Evan Miller. It was 2003. The Alabama prisoner was only 14 years old at the time when he was sentenced to life after killing Cole Cannon. During the pandemic, Evan Miller was actually resentenced to life without parole. The judge considered Miller's early exposure to violence and abuse, but ultimately the judge concluded with, quote, "The crime is why we are here. We are not here because Mr. Miller shuddered abuse at the hands of his father," end quote. Fair, you gotta keep it in the lane that you're operating in. Given that Miller was found the principal aggressor, that ship has sailed. Now, before I continue, I want to do a quick shout out to our history channel, Bumblebee. We do a lot of top 10s over there as well, but it's all Victorian criminals, gladiator history, those really long pointed shoes that some people would wear. dark stuff like that. It's a great time. Bumblebee, go check it out after we're done here. I'll see you there myself. Number 5, Bobby Bostic. It was a rough go for Bobby his entire life, and by age 10 he was partaking in illegal narcotics. By age 13 he was stealing cars, and while still on copious amounts of said narcotics, come December 1995, Bobby Bostic was only 16 and he was at a friend's house. Everybody was involved in all these illegal substances, just stuff you shouldn't be consuming at a young age, and Bobby got into an altercation with another female at the same house. Bobby was 16 when he was found guilty of 17 different horrible crimes that took place that night. All consecutive sentences also, which is a horrible sign. Bobby, as of right now, is set to live in prison until January 2091. Yeah, he will be 112 by time that sentence is up, so yeah, he probably won't ever get out. Number 4, Frederick Pritchett. On November 29th, 2012, Pritchett was only 17 years old, which at this point is kind of old in this list, you would say. He was just 17 when he was sentenced to 55 years in prison for armed robbery and kidnapping and motor vehicle theft. That's a nasty 3 right there. But things get even worse, dare I say. Cut to less than a month later, Frederick Pritchett was charged with aggravated assault on a law enforcement officer and robbery involving an incident while still in custody. Can you believe that? This all happened after he had received 55 years at the Lauderdale County Detention Center. All of a sudden, a correctional officer hands a cup of water to Pritchett, and that's when he grabbed her arm, put his arm around her neck, and then held her for about 2 minutes before ultimately releasing her. Her cell phone was also later found in his cell, so it comes to no surprise that he was convicted again for these acts, and this time around he was given an additional 45 years. So he won't be released until 2111. I'm not even gonna say the years. 2111. That sounds like it's so far away. 2111. No way. 2111? No. They all sound so fake and weird. They all sound so wrong. I remember when 1999 was like, all right, that's cool. 2002, you're like, yeah, it's 2111. You're like, Jesus, slow down. What? That's so many numbers. Number 3, Johnsha Bell. Back in 1994, Johnsha Bell was only 17 years old, and he managed to get sentenced to a total of 95 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Big yikes. See, Bell was convicted of armed robbery, burglary, and 2 counts of kidnapping. Again, that is a nasty bundle of offenses. And the worst part about all of this, he was sentenced as a habitual offender, meaning that chances of getting out are now slim to none. Jake Howard, an attorney with the MacArthur Justice Center in Mississippi, he argues that, quote, Mr. Bell's aggregated sentence guarantees that he will die in prison, end quote. Now, as we near the end of our list today, I have to ask, do you agree with these sentences so far? Do you think being locked up until you're 113 years old is a fair punishment ever? Or do you believe that people have the opportunity to change? Comment down below. Obviously, it depends which case, but it's tough. Number 2, Stephen Thomas. Stephen Thomas pleaded guilty in 2007 in Madison County Circuit to kidnapping, forcible sexual and armed robbery. Again, horrible stuff. Thomas was only 17 at the time and he was sentenced to 70 years. Thomas later asked the court for an evidentiary hearing in his case and argued that his sentence was cruel and an unusual punishment, and the court denied his petition. So he will be there until the absolute rest of his life. And finally, number 1, Edward Lamont Neal. Now forced to serve 95 years behind bars, Edward Lamont Neal committed, as you would have guessed, a handful of horrific crimes. He was initially sentenced to 5 years for that initial offense, and then not soon after got 5 years for jail escape in Lowndes County. Now you doubled your sentence, all because you watched The Shawshank Redemption and you felt inspired. You wanted to make a run for it. It's not worth it. But he was later convicted of burglary on an unoccupied dwelling. Not great, and he was subsequently given 25 more years in prison. Later, in a separate case, Edward Lamont Neal was given 60 years as a habitual offender after being convicted for armed robbery and aggravated assault. So he won't be out until 2098. In other words, he won't be out. Probably not ever, unless a skeleton walked out of the jail, and that's the only way we'd see him walk out.
Starting off this countdown, we have Richard Matt. Matt's career as a criminal started off when he was young. He was involved in robberies, kidnappings, and then eventually murder. The first murder he committed was of his former boss. He then fled to Mexico to avoid being caught. While there, he murdered a second man while attempting to rob him. In 2007, he was convicted for the murders and began serving a 25-year to life sentence. But guess what? 2015, he actually escaped the facility with a fellow inmate, and they spent 20 days on the run before getting re-caught. And apparently he has a history of jailbreaks, so I don't know why they just didn't pay closer attention to him. In the end, this was his final escape since he was caught and killed by Border Patrol while trying to flee to Canada. In our 9th spot, we have the dating game killer. This dude gets his name because while police were looking for him, he appeared on TV for an episode of the dating game in 1978. He did this in the midst of his murder spree. In fact, the dater on the show actually chose him, but when they met afterwards, she said that she got a bad feeling around him and they never actually went on a date, which that was a close call for her, because during his appearance on the show, he had already murdered at least 5 women. His date would have probably been his next victim. This killer would often toy with his victims. He would strangle them until they lost consciousness, then he would revive them, and then repeat this process several times before taking their lives. In the end, he was convicted of murdering 5 women, but police think that his kill count is much higher. In our 8th spot, we have the razor blade. This story comes from a prisoner who was locked away in a Texas prison. The prisoner told the story of a fellow inmate who everyone feared. It was this woman who would violently lash out on her fellow inmates. One time, she even put a razor blade in a bar of soap and would use it to cut up other prisoners. When the guards found them, there was blood everywhere. So yeah, I can see why people fear her. I wouldn't want to get on her bad side, let alone even look at her. Moving on to number 7, we have Ronnie McPeters. One of the scariest inmates in the world is said to be Ronnie McPeters. Ronnie was sent to jail for the murder of a 27-year-old woman in 1984. The woman, Linda Marie Baltazar, was running errands when Ronnie came up to her window panhandling. She shooed him away and he left, but then he ended up coming back, this time armed. He then shot her 5 times. As a result, he was arrested and sent to Fresno jail. But his bad behavior never stopped. While in jail, he would set fires, attack other prisoners, and even sometimes would, smear his feces on the walls and floors and sometimes all over his body. Now, he was actually put on death row for his crimes, but he was deemed, and I quote, too insane to be executed. In our 6th spot, we have Joanna Dennehy. Joanna is a serial killer who in March of 2013 went on a 10-day killing spree. She murdered 3 men, but her goal was to murder 9. She said she wanted to be like the killers Bonnie and Clyde. After killing the men, she would throw their bodies in ditches. In fact, she has the title of one of Britain's most notorious female murderers. While in prison, Joanna has made it a point to prove to other serial killers that she is the best killer among them. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with the inmate from hell. So this story comes from a nurse who worked at a prison. She shared the story of the scariest inmate that she has ever encountered. This inmate would go around biting officers in their arms and shoulders. He would headbutt them as well as even punch them directly in the face. He has broken people's bones and even ripped out chunks of flesh off of them with his teeth. Yeah, that must have been terrifying to see, like what the heck. Moving on to number 4, we have Pascal Payet. Pascal Payet is a French criminal who was sent to jail for committing a murder during a robbery in 1997. But he is famous for his daring prison escapes. In 2001, this dude managed to escape prison using a hijacked helicopter. But he didn't perform this stunt just once. No, he escaped twice. So obviously he was caught and then sent back to jail. Then in 2007, he did it again. It only took him 5 minutes. Within that time frame, 4 masked men hijacked a helicopter and took the pilot hostage. They then landed on the roof of the prison and used some device to open the doors and get Pascal out of his cell. Like I said, they were in and out within 5 minutes. 2 days after this escape, an arrest warrant was issued against him. Nowadays, he is never kept at the same prison for more than 6 months, and he is placed in solitary confinement where he is under high surveillance. They don't want him escaping for a 3rd time. In our 3rd spot, we have Damien Folks. Alright folks, let's talk about Damien Folks. See what I did there? Anyways, this guy, don't get me started. So this guy was serving a life in term in jail for armed robbery. While in jail, he attacked a number of prisoners. He strangled killer Colin Hatch with strips of bedding and also slashed the throat of Soham murderer Ian Huntley. And this is what he had to say to that. He said, "I hope I killed him. I've been planning it for weeks." Now, Ian Huntley did survive, but he had a 7-inch wound that just missed his jugular vein. But that's why Damien is considered incredibly dangerous. In our second spot, we have Mark Hobson. Mark Hobson went on a killing spree in North Yorkshire, England in 2004. As a result, he took the lives of 4 people. But he was also involved in a nationwide manhunt, which involved more than 500 police officers and 12 police forces all looking for him. During that time, he was considered Britain's most wanted man. And this is another dude that is not afraid to get violent with others. In September of 2005, he poured a bucket of boiling water over a fellow killer. And on a number of other occasions, he has attacked other prisoners. As a result, he is another prisoner who is kept under close surveillance at all times. And in our number 1 spot today, we have Robert Maudsley. Robert Maudsley has actually been named Britain's most dangerous prisoner. Now you might be wondering, Lindsay, why is that? Well, oh boy, let me tell you. In 1977, Maudsley and his fellow inmates held another prisoner hostage. They tortured him for 9 hours before cracking his head open and killing him. And rumor has it that he even ate some of the prisoner's brain. As a result, he was deemed the real-life Hannibal Lecter. A couple months later, he murdered 2 other inmates, then casually told the prison officer that during the next roll call, he would be too short. As a result, he's actually kept in an isolated glass cell so guards can see what he's up to at all times. They don't want another hostage situation to occur ever again.
Number 10. Abigail Williams. I'm putting Abigail Williams on this list because the whole ordeal just makes me so mad. By claiming that she was bewitched, she sparked a massive witch hunt, literally one of the most illogical points in history, leading to the most unnecessary deaths of so many people. I hate her. I can't even watch a production of The Crucible without needing to break stuff after. It makes me so mad. Look, I don't know whether her claims were true, that she and the other girls were afflicted because of witchcraft, or the more likely latter event of them eating an infected piece of grain. Maybe that happened, but I'll let you decide. Abigail Williams was living with her uncle Reverend Samuel Parris and started practicing mild witchcraft with his daughter and Tituba and John Indian, his slaves. You know, the kind of witchcraft where you drop an egg in the water and see the name of your future husband, or I don't know, like where you're gonna go tomorrow, that kind of stuff. Apparently they saw a coffin in the glass and that freaked them out, so they started acting weird. Other girls followed suit. Keep in mind they were around 11 or 12. So, alright, imagination. And then Abigail just kept accusing people like all the time, and if you admitted you were a witch, you were pardoned, and if you didn't, you were killed, okay? So, technically she was never in prison. But she put a lot of people there on bullshit, and then they claimed possession to get out. So I say that this deserves to be number 10. Yep, there it is. Number 9, Luis Zambrano. Luis was a man from Queens who took the life of his ex-girlfriend Angie Escobar in her Whitestone home. She was just 28 years old and had just broken up with him when he violently attacked her, inflicting 80 wounds with a pair of scissors. But he didn't just claim that he was heartbroken. No, the reason he killed her was because of 1, trust issues, that's a given, she's an ex for a reason, and 2, you guessed it, demonic possession. A quote from Luis reads, quote, "If you believe in demonic possession, you'd know I was under the influence of drugs and alcohol. I barely remember what happened," unquote, he said. Dude, it caught you, just fess up, man. The devil doesn't just conveniently show up when you do something really awful, okay? He's busy building the next Apple update and creating pop-up ads, okay? Thankfully, the court saw right through him and sentenced Zambrano to 26.5 years in prison. Game over, Satan! Number 8, Eder Guzman Rodriguez. In Virginia back in 2011, Rodriguez performed a violent exorcism, if you can even call it that, on his very young daughter. He attempted to rid her of the demon he believed was inside her, and it ended up costing her her life. When police arrived at the scene, several people were holding Bibles outside their home. Eder stated that while he took his daughter's life, he too was also possessed by a bad spirit. Yeah. It's called being an awful human being. Look it up. The girl was found on a bed, wrapped in a blanket, surrounded by Bibles. Guzman had also knocked his wife unconscious so she wouldn't be able to stop the exorcism. To this day, he stands by his claim while also admitting to the crime. Guzman was sentenced to 20 years and 11 months in prison. Number 7, Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. Man, I hate how this guy is on every list, but here he is again. An interview was released that Rader believed it was a demon that pushed him to take the lives of those 10 people. By now, if you follow our channel or are a true crime fan, you know what BTK stands for. And if you don't, Google it because YouTube won't let me say it. Rader was a very religious man and was a leader in his community, but despite his connection to godliness, Rader confessed that he believes a demon entered him when he was a young boy. How convenient, as that's when he started to notice his dark side. He told Larry Hatberg during an interview, and I quote, "How could a guy like me, a church member, raise a family, go out and do those sorts of things?" he said. Quote, "I personally think, and I know it's not very Christian, but I actually think it's a demon that's within me." Unquote. Or you're just an awful human being saying it together. That's great. Let's move on. Number 6, David Berkowitz, the son of Sam. The son of Sam terrorized NYC for a period in the 1970s and was finally caught in 1977. He would carry out what appeared to be random shootings, claiming 6 lives, wounding 7 more with a .44 caliber revolver. David frequented lovers' lanes, and women even went to salons to rid themselves of brown hair so they wouldn't be targets because they thought that was his thing. Alongside the crimes, postal worker turned shooter blamed his actions on his neighbor's dog, who he said was actually possessed by a 6,000-year-old demon. Apparently his name was Harvey, and Berkowitz was simply following his instructions. Number 5, Pazazu Algared. Now this one is a little freaky because one of the people who lived in the same building as Pazazu swore he was possessed. The name Pazazu is actually the name of the demon mentioned in the film The Exorcist. Pazazu was arrested after authorities discovered a dead body in his backyard, along with another that he helped his wife bury a year prior. If there's anyone on this list that could actually have been possessed, then it might have been this guy. Maybe number 1. He was a satanic fanatic and even went so far as to fork his own tongue and saw his teeth razor sharp. Ugh. An anonymous quote from the man who lived with Pazazu said, quote, "It was very serpentine and his eyes would kind of get a little like glazy, like almost not there, like the inner part of him would kind of phase away. You could tell when his demons needed something from him because they took over." Unquote. Ugh. Also important to note that the house that he lived in was so gross, it was deemed unsafe for human life. There was filth, human and not everywhere, demonic and evil symbols on the walls. Ugh, yeah, not a place you'd want to find yourself, especially since the man who lived there might have been the demon Pazazu himself. Number 4, Michael Taylor. I swear there was something about the 70s that just like bred crazy wacko serial killers. Like, anyone else feel that way? Were they just there all along and we finally started to notice? I don't know, but we have yet another serial killer on our list who also claimed possession. Even before he violently took his wife's life, Taylor suspected that he was possessed by a demonic spirit. He was a simple butcher living in Ossett, England, who was suddenly overcome by a darkness he couldn't explain. He underwent an overnight exorcism performed on him on October 5th, 6th in 1974, and though it reportedly worked, some of the demons, yes, plural, kept hanging on. According to someone involved, they invoked and cast out at least 40 demons, though 3 remained. They were pretty bad. After he returned home, he viciously took the life of his wife, removing her eyes and tongue, most of her skin from her face, and took their pet's life as well. When police found Taylor, he was standing in the street covered in blood, yelling, quote, "It is the blood of Satan," unquote. I don't know what to believe about that one. Demonic possession doesn't seem like an afterthought here, whereas it does with the other ones, so what do you think, guys? Number 3, Deborah and Adolfo Gomez. Okay, whether for 5 minutes or 10 years, we all believed at some point that the prophecy about 2012 being the end of the world was true. But it appears no one believed as hard as Deborah and Adolfo Gomez, who were not only convinced that 2012 was the end of the world, but that their house was possessed by a demon. Yeah. The couple was arrested after restraining their children with duct tape in their SUV because they also were demon possessed. Apparently they would often cover their eyes and mouths with duct tape in order to keep the demons out. Oh my god. When police finally caught up with them in Lawrence, Kansas, they also discovered that Adolfo hadn't slept for 9 days. How that happened, we don't know, but it may explain why he thought he was possessed. Sleep deprivation can cause some serious harm. The longest anyone has ever gone without it, I think, was 11 days. And after just 4 or 5 days of no sleep, people start to hallucinate, so maybe that's the reason. Number 2, Aljar Schwartz. In 2013, Aljar Schwartz from South Africa claimed he had become possessed by vague satanic attacks. Of course, he wouldn't be on this list if he didn't. This was verified by Reverend Cecil Begbie and confirmed that this was the cause for Schwartz's crime. He strangled and then beheaded his victim in an abandoned school in October of that year. Oh my god. Reports say that Aljar planned on selling the head to a traditional healer. He was caught and incarcerated, however, but his community stood behind him, weirdly. Reverend Begbie instructed church groups across Africa to pray for Schwartz on the Good Friday following his arrest. Schwartz reportedly felt like pure water was washing over him at the time of the prayer, and now claims the demons are no longer in possession of him. This, however, will not mitigate his sentence. And lastly, number 1, Arne Cheyenne Johnson. Johnson sparked controversy far and wide in a case that became known as the Devil Made Me Do It case. In 1981, 19-year-old Arne Cheyenne Johnson was arguing with Alan Bono over Johnson's girlfriend when Arne stabbed Bono to death. When authorities arrived, you can guess what Johnson said: "The devil made me do it." Hence the title of the case. So you'd expect the officer to be like, yeah, whatever, buddy, keep on walking, but no. There is a reason this case is in our number 1 spot. Every paranormal investigator worth their salt, including the beloved Ed and Lorraine Warren, flocked to Connecticut to interview him. But the Warrens were there to defend him because they already knew him. The Warrens told police that in July 1980, Johnson had participated in at least 3 exorcisms involving his girlfriend's 11-year-old brother David. He reportedly was host of 43 demons. The Warrens stated that at the time of the exorcism, and I quote, "Johnson leaped up and cried to the demon, 'Come into me, I'll fight you, come into me.' From that time on, he was possessed." Unquote. The Paranormal Society was split in 2, but Johnson's team was committed. The court had defended accounts of God in the past. Now, it was time to defend accounts of the devil. But despite what you may believe, it wasn't enough, and Johnson received maximum sentence, but was released after good behavior just 4 years later. Number 10, the Eyeball Man. Can anyone honestly say they aren't scared of this guy? The dude blacked out his eyeball, so he looked like a demonic Jack Skellington. More like Hack Skellington. Eyeball Man's real name is Jason Barnum and is currently living out a 22-year sentence for shooting an Alaska police officer. Barnum's crime was heavily influenced by a hefty addiction to chasing the dragon. 3 officers were investigating vehicle break-ins and burglaries in South Anchorage and spotted a vehicle related to the attacks in a hotel parking lot. They checked out the security footage and saw a man carrying a tote to room 209. Barnum and 2 others were in the room, and when officers entered the bathroom, the shootout began. Barnum was injured in the arm, but they arrested him when he got out of the hospital, and they had to deal with how terrifying he looks, even though he's behind bars, so yeah. Number 9, Eric R. Rudolph. Resourceful and resilient, Eric R. Rudolph quickly got on America's most wanted list. Why? Well, during 1996 to 1998, Eric detonated bombs 4 times in Atlanta and Birmingham, taking the lives of 2 people and injuring thousands. A 5-year manhunt ensued. He was finally caught in May 2003 after he was found rummaging through a dumpster. Later, it was revealed how intense his survival skills were. For 5 years, Eric foraged off the lands and survived off of buried barrels of grain and soy. He learned the schedules of when produce was going to be thrown out at grocery stores and stole what he could where it wouldn't be noticed. His motivation behind the bombings was a compilation of radical anti-gay, anti-abortion, and anti-government. The list goes on. He didn't get along with other people, and when he confessed to his crimes, he showed no remorse. But when he was taken away to go to prison, authorities report that the man had tears in his eyes, knowing he was utterly defeated. What can I say, man? Your actions brought you to where you are now, so sorry about it. Sorry, not sorry. Number 8, Robert P. Hansen. The man the FBI was afraid of, and he was right
under their noses, joining them for lunch in the cafe, grabbing coffee with them, laughing at the cooler. But all the while, Robert P. Hansen was a mole. On February 18th, 2001, Robert was arrested and charged with committing espionage on behalf of intelligence services for the former Soviet Union and their successors. He was caught red-handed placing a package containing highly classified information at a park in Vienna, Virginia for his Russian handlers. When the FBI searched his apartment, it became apparent his payment was in cash and diamonds with a value of over $600,000. Hansen handed over dozens of delicate files, including FBI counterintelligence investigative techniques, sources, methods, operations. He exposed the FBI's secret investigation of Felix Bloch, a Foreign Service officer for espionage. He pled guilty to 15 counts of espionage on July 6, 2001 and was sentenced to prison without the possibility of parole. He is considered the most dangerous spy in FBI history. God knows what he said. Number 7. David Carpenter. I know Lisa Rinna from Dancing with the Stars because I love a good foxtrot. Love it. But she's actually more well known for being a desperate housewife. But it turns out that her very own mother was actually David Carpenter's first victim. She knew him from work and he offered to give her a ride home, and he had kids and a wife. Soon he was on top of her, hammer and knife in hand, but thankfully a cop was nearby who suspected something was amiss, so she was saved. David was sentenced to 14 years in prison where he was diagnosed as a sociopath with a very high IQ. He was released after only 9 years and quickly went on to commit more attacks against women. Good call on releasing him, just saying. Like, what? Ugh. I hate that. I hate that. At one time, he was even suspected of being the Zodiac Killer. Instead, he became known as the trailside killer who would prey on women on hiking trails. He took the lives of 10 people, though it's probable that there were more. Just 2 survived, and officers described that he was a kind of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde kind of behavior. He was super nice, but then he had this insane, psycho, creepy, dark side as well. Number 6. Zacharias Moussaoui. The ADX prison is intended as a holding cell to teach prisoners proper conduct before they are sent to penitentiaries. However, some are so bad that they are never released for fear they might inspire new crimes if allowed to communicate to those outside the walls. Zacharias is one of them. He is currently serving out 6 life sentences for assisting the hijackers who carried out the, you guessed it, the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center. Moussaoui was placed on a watch list in 1999 when he started interacting with Islamist extremists. He could have prevented the attacks entirely, however he lied to the FBI about the Al-Qaeda and their plans to attack the US. He was even supposed to pilot a plane into the White House. He was arrested in August 2001 and went on trial in 2006. Throughout the trial, he praised the Al-Qaeda and was removed for several outbursts. A very different tone to the note he wrote recently in 2020 renouncing Al-Qaeda and appealed to younger Muslims to be wary of their deceptive ways. I really do hope he has genuinely released those ideals. However, he did do it in an attempt to relax his sentence. As recently as 2018, he was still referring to himself as a natural-born terrorist, so needless to say, I don't see things relaxing anytime soon. Number 5. The Marathon Bomber. Jahar Tsarnaev. Speaking of the ADX prison, there is yet another permanent resident behind its walls. Jahar Tsarnaev is responsible for the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing, which took the lives of 3 people and injured 250 people in the large crowd. This event shook the world, and I remember when it happened. I remember checking my phone repeatedly in order to figure out what's happening and follow with updates, and I'm sure a lot of you do too. He and his brother Tamerlane used 2 pressure cookers packed with explosives and shrapnel. His brother was shot during a police chase while Jahar was taken into custody. He was 19 when he committed the crime and 21 when he was finally tried. The trial consisted of heartbreaking testimonies from families of the injured and the dead. The death penalty was disbanded in Boston for decades, but it was considered for this case as it was a federal case. He was instead given his life sentence to be served out in solitary confinement with no opportunities to communicate with the outside world, and that is probably how it's going to remain for the rest of his life. Wow, so young. Number 4. The Nethari Killers. The Nethari crimes came to light on December 29, 2006 after 8 skeletal remains of young bodies were found in the drain of a house in Nethari, Noida. The owner of the house and the businessman Mohinder Singh Pandher and the domestic help Surinder Kohli were arrested. Soon after they were found, even more bodies turned up. The village had been making noise about the disappearances for a while before anything was done, but now the Nethari killers remain some of the most horrific people behind bars. Over 16 young people fell victim to
kidnapping, vicious bodily violations, and death, which believed to have occurred between 2005 to 2006. Both men have been found guilty and the death penalty is in discussion, though has been delayed. Some believe that there is money involved in the case that may result in an unfair result, but considering the severity of the case, release is not really on the table. I'm not gonna lie, it was hard to get a straight story on this. There's a lot of convoluted details across the articles I could find, so if you have more info you want to share, drop it down below. Number 3, Larry Hoover. This dude is so powerful that he was continuing to run his operation while serving out a 200-year sentence for murder. Larry Hoover was/is, I suppose, the chairman of the notorious gangster Disciples gang. He was convicted 2 decades ago of continuing to run his empire behind bars. Hoover, now 70, is serving out 6 life sentences at the Supermax Federal Prison in Florence, Colorado, a facility that holds the worst of the worst: terrorists, mobsters, anyone who'd be a danger to anyone from the outside. It is said to be the most secure in the country. He established the gang in Chicago in the 1960s and has recently decided to try and take some of them down. The indictment accused 7 state and national leaders of the gangster Disciples of racketeering conspiracy, drug trafficking, witness intimidation, and multiple murders, including the 2018 death of a 65-year-old ranking member of the gang on Chicago's South Side. Beware if you've ever crossed Larry Hoover, because even behind bars, you can't stop him. Number 2, James Marcello. I honestly sound like I'm in a 1940s film noir when I was researching this. You'll see why in a second. He is the highest ranking Chicago mob boss in prison, also known as Jimmy the Man Marcello. Now at the age of 76, he filed a petition in June 2020 to have his sentence tossed out. Jimmy was one of 5 top criminals who were convicted of the 2007 Family Secrets racketeering case. He was convicted of taking the lives of Tony the Ant Spilotro and his brother Michael. They were found in a cornfield in June 1986 after being beaten and strangled to death in Jimmy's basement. He was sentenced to life in prison in 2009 and currently resides at the Supermax facility in Colorado, just like Mr. Hoover. Marcello's father was also in the biz, and so was his big brother, Big Mickey. The family had influence. There were crimes that hit the news and crimes no one knows about. Either way, now Jimmy wants out. He's like, come on, give an old guy a break. Not for you, Jimmy. Not for you.
Starting off this countdown, we have Nikolai Zhumagaliev. This guy is so evil that it's hard to believe what he did was real. So Nikolai is a Soviet serial killer who took the lives of at least 10 people in the 1980s. He would target women and would often axe them to death, after which he would eat them. In fact, he was given the name Metal Fang because he had false teeth made from white metal. That way, it was easier for him to be able to eat into the flesh. In the late 1980s, he was caught after having one of his friends over, and the friend found a human head and intestines inside of his fridge. After that, he was arrested and tried but declared insane. In 1989, when he was transported to another facility, Nikolai actually escaped and was on the run for 2 years. Thankfully, he was caught and re-institutionalized. But in December of 2016, he escaped again, but officials refused to confirm the claim. Either way, be careful around this guy, like he might try and escape for the 3rd time. Moving on to number 9, we have Alan Leger. Alan Leger is a Canadian serial killer who on June 21st of 1986 entered a convenience store in Black River Bridge, New Brunswick with 2 other accomplices and robbed the joint. While doing so, they beat the store owner to death, but they were later caught and arrested. He was given a life sentence and sent to prison. However, in 1989, he managed to escape and was on the run for 7 months. During this time, he killed 4 more innocent people. He also committed arson and a list of other crimes as well. Eventually, he was recaptured and is now spending the rest of his life in Canada's maximum security special handling unit. Moving on to number 8, we have Rodney Halbauer. Ever since Rodney was young, he has been committing crimes. It started when he was only 16 years old. During his younger years, he was arrested and released on parole a number of times. But when released, he would commit more crimes, like theft. In 1975, Rodney was released on bail after taking advantage of a Las Vegas blackjack dealer. But while on bail, he took advantage of and killed 6 other women and received a life sentence. However, in 1977, he actually escaped jail and kidnapped his own daughter. Shortly after, he was recaptured, only to escape again in 1986. While on the run, he stabbed and injured another woman. Thankfully, once again, he was recaptured. Wouldn't you think after the first time they would keep a closer eye on him? I guess not. In our 7th spot, we have Thomas Silverstein. Now, this dude is said to be one of the most dangerous prisoners of all time, and the most violent prisoner in America. He was first jailed in 1978 for armed robbery. While in jail, he killed a prison officer and 2 inmates. He also was the leader for the Aryan Brotherhood prison gang for quite some time. This prison gang is the largest and deadliest prison gang in the US, with an estimated 20,000 members inside the prison and on the streets. Because of how many people he killed and injured in prison, Silverstein got transferred to a federal prison in Atlanta. There, he was confined in a 6-by-7-foot cell. He was under 24-hour surveillance. In fact, the lights in his cell were never turned off so that they could always watch him. Silverstein eventually died in prison at the age of 67. In our 6th spot today, we have Victor Figueroa. On February 6, 1997, Victor Figueroa managed to escape Maroa Shock Incarceration Facility in Mineville, New York. Victor had been serving a 1 to 4 year sentence for drug possession, but decided to take his chances and flee. When authorities noticed that he was missing, they searched the area, but all the leads ran cold. He has not been seen or heard from since. In fact, he's the only New York State prison inmate to escape and never be found. Either he's still out there or he died while trying to escape. Either way, it's a bit scary thinking that he could potentially still be out there. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with James Eddie Diggs. To the public, James Eddie Diggs seemed like a top-notch citizen. He seemed to be a great family man with a happy wife and 2 young sons. However, in the morning of May 26, 1949, he shot and killed his wife and kids before disappearing forever. Police did manage to find him a week later, but he managed to escape the officer by shooting him in the face and killing him. He's since fled into the woods and hasn't been caught since. In fact, he was one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives for the longest time, but he was eventually removed from the list in 1961 and is said to be dead by now. In our 3rd spot, we have George Edward Wright. In 1962, George Edward Wright was convicted for murder and was sentenced to up to 30 years in prison. Wright and 3 other men went on a spree of armed robbery, one in which they shot a man and took off with his money, which was only $70, so was it really worth it? Anyways, they were caught and put into jail. But then in 1970, Wright managed to escape from a prison in New Jersey. He was caught and locked up once again, only to escape once more in 1972. This time, he made sure he was never going to be caught again. So he came up with a plan. This plan involved hijacking a Delta Airlines flight and collecting ransom for the release of the passengers. Upon doing so, they flew the plane to Portugal. In 2011, the police caught up with him in Portugal, but since Portugal has no extradition treaty with the United States, Wright was released. He remains a fugitive to this day. Coming in at number 2, we have Eric Rudolph. In 1996, Eric Rudolph bombed Atlanta's Centennial Olympic Park during the Summer Games. As a result, 2 individuals were killed and over 100 were injured. But that was just the beginning of his deadly bombing spree. He pulled off 3 more bombings, injuring hundreds more. For 5 years, the police were on a hunt for Eric. At one point, he was one of the top 10 fugitives on the FBI's list. It wasn't until 2003 that Eric got arrested. Turns out that he was hiding in the mountains for 5 years. Being a skilled outdoorsman, this helped him greatly. When he was caught, he pled guilty to all 4 bombings and was given 4 life sentences without the possibility of parole. He's now spending the rest of his life in the super prison in Florence, Colorado. And in our number 1 spot today, we have Santiago Mederos. In 2010, Santiago fired into a random person's car because one of the passengers was wearing the wrong color jacket. The victim had no ties to any gang. He was just an innocent person riding in his sister's car. He was severely injured and his sister was unfortunately killed. A couple weeks later, Santiago and some of his friends were robbing a car, and when a group of men tried to stop them, he shot at them as well. He killed a random person that was just at the wrong place at the wrong time. From there, he was on the run for about a decade. He was finally caught in 2020 in Mexico. Starting off this countdown, we have the Hitchhiker's Killer. The Hitchhiker's Killer is the name given to serial killer Donald Henry Gaskins. He started his killings in 1969, where he would pick up hitchhikers to later kill them. It's believed that he killed more than a dozen people. But even before he went on this killing spree, Gaskins had a history of sick crimes. Finally, on November 14th of 1975, Gaskins was arrested after a man witnessed him killing 2 men and called the police. He was later sentenced to death, but this sentence turned into life imprisonment without any possibility of parole. However, his killings did not stop while behind bars. While in prison, he became the only man to have ever killed an inmate on death row. In our 9th spot today, we have Glenn Stark Chambers. In January of 1975, Glenn Stark Chambers got into a heated dispute with his girlfriend, Connie Weeks. It ended with him taking her life. As a result, he was sentenced to death by electric chair, later reduced to life imprisonment. However, Glenn escaped prison on July 13th. Glenn, with 2 other inmates, ganged up to attack their detention officer and then escaped through a window. Now, he was captured 3 days later, but only to escape several years later. So he worked with the prison to help build furniture. He came up with a good idea to put himself into one of the boxes and have himself carried out of prison in a transport truck, and it worked. Even after 3 decades, Glenn has never been found. If he was still alive today, he would be in his 70s, so he could still be out there somewhere. In our 8th spot, we have Ted Bundy. Now, what was so scary about Ted Bundy is how smart he was. He was the definition of evil genius. So basically, he would use his smarts to manipulate women and then kill them. Bundy is said to be responsible for murdering 30 women, although it's thought that his number is much higher. Now, Bundy was actually able to escape custody multiple times. The first time, he jumped out of a 2nd-story building and fled while at the courthouse. He had planned this for days, practicing jumping from his top bed bunk in prison down to the floor to strengthen his ankles. Now, eventually he was caught, but then a while later, he escaped again. This time, he forced himself to lose weight in order to squeeze through a hole in his cell ceiling. When he did escape the 2nd time, he went on to murder more women, until being caught once again. In our 7th spot, we have Charles Manson. Infamous cult leader Charles Manson, who led the Manson family cult, had his followers commit crimes and murders on his behalf. Some of his members committed a series of 9 murders in July and August of 1969. In 1971, Manson was convicted of 1st-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder for the deaths of 7 people, including film actress Sharon Tate. What's scary about Manson is that he was also an evil genius. If you've ever seen his interviews, he acts quite wild and strange. People think that he's out of his mind. At one point, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and paranoid delusion disorder, but some people think that he was just too smart for his own good and he was just faking all of this. In 1971, Manson received the death sentence, but a year later, the government got rid of capital punishment, so his sentence was changed to life in prison instead. In our 6th spot, we have Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. Between 1963 and 1965, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley worked together to torture, take advantage of, and kill a number of young individuals. What they did was incredibly messed up, and it'll make your stomach churn. Now, these two were actually given the name the Moors Murderers because after taking the lives of their victims, they would bury their bodies on the moors outside of Manchester. Both individuals were sentenced to life in prison for their crimes. Ian was actually placed in solitary confinement, whereas Myra died in prison in 2002. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with Lester Eubanks. In 1965, Lester was convicted of taking the life of Mary Ellen Diener. As a result, he was given the death penalty, which later got changed to a life sentence. Now, over the years in prison, apparently Lester changed his ways and became very well behaved. In fact, on December 7th, 1973, they let him go out to Christmas shop for his family. While out in a mall, he managed to escape his guards and flee. To this day, he still hasn't been caught. He's out there somewhere in hiding. Who knows where he fled to or what he's up to now. Coming in at number 4, we have Robert William Fisher. Now, this guy is one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives. He is on the run after a triple homicide and arson. On April 9th, 2001, Fisher took the lives of his wife and 2 children before blowing up their house. It is still unclear as to why he did this, and he's been on the run ever since. And police have no leads. On April 20th, his car was found in a forest near Payson, Arizona, but Robert was nowhere to be found. On November 3rd, 2021, Fisher was removed from the FBI's most wanted fugitives list. But despite them doing this, he still remains a very wanted fugitive. In our 3rd spot, we have Bradford Bishop. Bradford Bishop Jr. is a former United States Foreign Service officer who is now a wanted fugitive. On March 1st of 1976, Bishop started to spiral after not receiving receiving the promotion he really wanted. He then left his work early, drove to the bank, withdrew money, and then bought a sledgehammer, gas can, shovel, and pitchfork. He then returned home where he killed his wife, mother, and 3 sons. He then drove the bodies several miles away before burying them in a wooded swamp area before setting them on fire. As a result, he was placed on the FBI's list of 10 most wanted fugitives. They have no clue as to where Bishop is now. He could be anywhere, but they do believe that he fled to Europe. Moving on to number 2, we have Arthur Hutchinson. Arthur Hutchinson has lived a life of crime for murder, attempted murder, theft, and burglary. In fact, he spent 5 years in prison for the attempted murder of his half-brother. In September of 1983, he was brought into a police station after being arrested for theft. While there, he asked to go to the bathroom and then proceeded to jump out of the bathroom window and fled. He was on the run for 3.5 weeks. While on the run, he crashed a wedding and murdered the bride's father, mother, and brother. Later that day, he broke into another person's home and stabbed all 3 of the residents to death. He was finally caught on November 5th of 1983 and sentenced to life imprisonment. And in our number 1 spot today, we have Ahmed Suraji. From 1986 to 1997, Ahmed took the lives of 42 females. The bodies of his victims were found in a sugarcane field. What he would do was, after killing them, he would bury them waist deep in his field with their heads facing his house. He believed that by doing so, this gave him great power. But he was later caught and arrested alongside his sisters and 3 wives who helped him. One of his wives was actually sentenced to death, but that was later changed to life imprisonment.
Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Angel Resendez. Also known as the Railroad Killer, Angel is said to have committed somewhere around 23 horrific crimes during his spree in both the United States and Mexico in the 1990s. He went on to become known as the Railroad Killer because of the fact that most of his crimes were committed near railroads, where he had just jumped off of trains he was using to travel around the country. Most of his crimes took place in the homes of those he harmed, and usually after the crimes he'd linger around to eat their food and sometimes steal their sentimental items. Sometimes he'd even take jewelry to re-gift to his mother and sister. In June of 1999, he was listed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, and when his sister saw him there, she was worried he would continue harming people, so she thankfully contacted the authorities. After this, they were able to convince him to surrender and he was sent to trial. In the end, he was sentenced to death by the jury, and although there were multiple appeal attempts, his death warrant was signed, and on June 27, 2006, he received his sentence. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Long Island serial killer. Also known as the Craigslist Ripper, the LISK is an unidentified suspect who is believed to have taken the lives of 10 to 16 people over the last 20 years. The victims so far that are known have been sex workers who used Craigslist to advertise their work. After the disappearance of Shannon Gilbert, police were searching an area along the Ocean Parkway, and that is when they began to discover the remains of the victims. The first 4 were found in December of 2010, with another 6 being found in March and April of 2011. As of December 2015, the FBI is now officially involved in the investigation. There has been a suspect in this case, but any formal charges have not been laid in terms of these crimes. The most recent evidence in regards to these cases was a belt found at the scene of the crime, which may potentially belong to the killer. At the same time, it was announced that new scientific evidence was being used in the investigation, but these announcements came just last year, so we have yet to receive any further updates. Hopefully this case is solved quickly so that the families of the victims can receive justice and this terrible person is off the streets for good. In our number 8 spot today, we have Richard Chase. This evil person is said to have taken the lives of 6 people within the span of a month between 1977 and 1978. That's a lot of people in a very short amount of time, which is absolutely terrifying. Before his crimes, Richard's life was already full of terrible stories and horrific acts that had him spending time in mental institutions before his crime spree. While at these facilities, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, but after going through treatment and beginning medication, he was deemed to no longer be a threat to society and was released into his mother's care. Here's where things take a turn for the worse, however. Instead of helping take care of Richard, his mother instead weaned him off of his medication and got him all set up with his own apartment. Nice. Really helpful and cool of her. Initially, when he moved into the apartment, he had roommates, but eventually they all moved out and he was alone, which is when things really got wild. He began killing various animals, which he would then eat raw, sometimes mixing the organs with Coca-Cola in a blender and then drinking it. It's horrible. After this, he would unfortunately go on his killing spree, which had horrific details and would only end when he was startled by a visitor at the home of where his final crime took place. He fled the scene, but he was later caught and stood trial. Although there were many attempts to have him be spared of the death sentence, in the end this didn't work. In December of 1980, Richard was found passed away in his jail cell after taking too many of his prescribed medication. In our number 7 spot today we have Rodney Alcala. Rodney is a horrible monster who was convicted and sentenced to death for 5 killings that he committed in California from 1977 to 1979. He also received an additional 25 years to life after pleading guilty to 2 other killings in New York in 1971 and 1977. Rodney got away with his crimes for a while because he wasn't the top of the list of suspects because he was said to be the quote charming photographer. Rodney is often referred to as the dating game killer because of his appearance on the show, which, with what we now know about him, is absolutely horrifying. What's crazy is that he actually won the show he was on, but the episode's bachelorette refused to go on a date with him because she found him creepy. This is just a reminder to always trust your instincts. It isn't exactly known just how many victims Rodney had. It is potentially thought that it could be much higher than the number he was convicted for. In July of last year, Rodney passed away in prison at the age of 77. In our number 6 spot today we have Charles Cullen. This guy used to be a nurse who took the lives of his patients throughout his career, and he may be one of the worst serial killers ever recorded. He confessed to taking the lives of 40 people, but through subsequent interviews, it became apparent that the number was way higher than 40, he just couldn't remember the names of all of them. But, of course, he could remember the details of all of his crimes against them. His crimes started in 1988 and spanned over a decade into 2003. In October of 2003, when a patient at a hospital passed away from low blood sugar, the authorities were called. This person was Charles' final victim, and authorities began looking into him and investigating his past employment history. On December 12, 2003, authorities were arresting him and charging him with only 1 count of his crimes, but he ended up admitting to 40. He ended up pleading guilty to his crimes and arranged a plea deal where authorities would not seek the death penalty if he cooperated. During one of his court proceedings, he continuously asked the judge to step down and apparently repeatedly chanted for 25 minutes straight, even after he was restrained and gagged for his outbursts. It is thought that his victims might be up in the 400 range, which is truly just unbelievable. In our number 5 spot today we have John Allen Muhammad and John Lee Malvo. This pair is referred to as the DC Snipers, and they were responsible for a series of coordinated attacks during a 3-week period in October of 2002. The pair took the lives of 10 people and critically injured 3 others during this spree, although their crimes spanned even before this and involved even more people. Their crimes were random and terrifying. People would just be going about their everyday tasks when this horrific pair would strike. Through a series of quote-unquote mistakes the pair made, they were able to be caught by authorities and arrested. In September of 2003, John Allen was sentenced to death, and this sentence was carried out in November of 2009. John Lee, on the other hand, was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences, but very recently it was determined that his sentence needs to be re-looked at because of his young age when the crimes were committed. In our number 4 spot today we have Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris. A 2-for-1 of the most horrific kind, this pair was often referred to as the toolbox killers. They received this name because most of what they used to commit their crimes would be items normally stored in a household toolbox. The pair committed 5 of these crimes in Southern California over a 5-month period in 1979. In the end, what led to their capture was when Roy met up with a friend with whom he had previously been incarcerated with. He confessed to the crimes to this person in great detail, and you know what this person did? They consulted their attorney about this horrifying confession, who then advised them to go to the authorities with the information. Thank goodness. Authorities, while they didn't have the evidence necessary to charge the men with the crimes at that time, were able to, through surveillance, find other things to arrest them for, while they searched their homes to find the evidence that they really did need. The pair stood trial, and in the end, Lawrence was sentenced to death, and Roy, who accepted a plea bargain and agreed to testify against Lawrence, received a life sentence. Lawrence died of natural causes while on death row in December of 2019, as did Roy at the California Medical Facility in 2020. 2020. FBI Special Agent John E. Douglas described Lawrence as the most disturbing individual for whom he has ever created a criminal profile. In our number 3 spot today we have Robert Hansen. Robert is often referred to as the Butcher Baker, and his story truly is horrific. He is one of the most prolific serial killers in Alaska's history because for over a decade he would kidnap women and bring them into the wilderness where he would then stalk them like prey. The reason he got away with his crimes for so long is because outside of these horrifying crimes, he was just a soft-spoken baker. Robert was heading to church by day and prowling the streets at night. What led to the downfall of this horrible monster was a badass named Cindy Paulson who was able to escape from Robert and was sure to leave evidence behind. She then went to authorities and told them what happened, and this led to a search warrant for Robert's property, which is where all the evidence they needed lied. Robert is believed to have taken the lives of at least 17 women, and in 1983 he was sentenced to 461 years and a life sentence without the possibility of parole. In our number 2 spot today we have William Bonin. This horrible person is said to be responsible for taking the lives of 21 young men in Southern California from May of 1979 to June 1980. It is said that on at least 12 of these occasions he was assisted by one of his 4 known accomplices, and it is even speculated that he might be responsible for 15 more of these crimes that evidence hasn't officially been able to connect him to. He was often referred to as the freeway killer because of the fact that most of the bodies were found along the freeway of Southern California. The police surveilled William until they could catch him in the act, which they did. In the beginning he claimed innocence. I mean, they caught him in the act, it's kind of dumb to claim innocence, but after receiving an impassioned letter from one of the victim's mothers, which asked him to please share the location of her son's body, he confessed his guilt. But he made sure to clarify that it wasn't so the mother could be at peace or so that her pain could be eased. No, of course not. Instead he said, quote, "I was dying for a hamburger and I knew if I went out with the cops they would get me a hamburger." At his first trial the prosecutor described him as, quote, "the most arch-evil person who ever existed." William was convicted on 14 of his crimes and was sentenced to death. He spent 14 years on death row before his sentence was carried out in 1996. In our number 1 spot today we have Israel Keyes. Israel is quite a prolific serial killer and truly is a terrifying person. While everyone on this list is horrible, Israel is particularly scary because of the fact that he had no MO or type, he just killed at random. In fact, he was so prepared for these random crimes that he left kill kits all over the US so that he would be prepared for whenever whoever he chose crossed his path. It isn't quite clear how many of these crimes he committed, and many missing persons reports that are still open could potentially be linked to him. It is said that Israel had a sort of admiration and obsession with other prolific serial killers like Ted Bundy or Robert Hansen, who we already talked about today. He even said, quote, "I probably know every single serial killer that's ever been written about. It's kind of a hobby of mine." So creepy. In March of 2012, Israel was finally apprehended and was to stand trial for his crimes, but unfortunately while waiting for trial, he went on to take his own life. He left behind a note and a drawing of 11 skulls, which led authorities to believe that this may be the number of victims he had. Starting off this list in our number 10 spot we have Carl Watts. Carl Watts, also known as Coral Eugene Watts, was an American serial killer who operated in the 1970s and 1980s. Born in Killeen, Texas, Watts was a quiet and unassuming individual who led a double life as a cold-blooded killer. Watts targeted and killed numerous women, primarily in Texas and Michigan. His victims were often young women and he would stalk them before attacking. Watts' crimes were characterized by their brutality and the lack of a discernible pattern, making it challenging for law enforcement to connect the cases. Despite his significant number of victims, Watts managed to evade capture for several years, partly due to his ability to blend into society and avoid suspicion. However, his luck ran out in 1982 when he was apprehended for burglary as well as an attempted killing. During questioning, he ended up confessing to multiple crimes, providing details that linked him to numerous unsolved cases. Watts eventually pleaded guilty to multiple counts and received a lengthy prison sentence. His cooperation with authorities allowed them to close several cold cases and bring closure to the families of his victims. Watts died of prostate cancer while serving his sentence on September 21st, 2007. Despite not achieving the same level of media coverage as some other infamous serial killers, Watts' actions left a trail of devastation and loss in the communities he targeted. In our number 9 spot today we have Johann Unterweger. Johann was an Austrian serial killer who terrorized Vienna Louisiana in the 1990s. Johann's criminal activities first gained attention in the late 1970s when he was convicted for taking the life of a young woman and sentenced to life in prison. However, during his incarceration, he managed to project a very reformed image, becoming an accomplished writer and gaining support from intellectuals who believed he had been rehabilitated. Due to his literary talent and the perception of his redemption, in a great miscarriage of justice, he was released on parole in 1990 after serving only 15 years of his life sentence. He soon became a media personality, presenting himself as a rehabilitated ex-convict and a crusader for the rights of prisoners. He even worked as a journalist and wrote articles on crime and rehabilitation, further enhancing his public image. However, beneath his charismatic persona, he harbored a dark and violent side. He began to commit heinous crimes again, committing a series of brutal killings that mirrored the style of his previous ones. Despite the gruesome nature of his crimes, Johann managed to evade suspicion for some time. He capitalized on his media connections to shape public opinion and divert attention from himself. However, his luck ran out when evidence linking him to the crimes started to mount. In 1992, he was arrested in Miami, Florida after being tracked down by Austrian and American authorities. He was extradited to Austria to stand trial for the killings of 11 women. The high-profile trial captivated the nation and received significant media coverage within Austria. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including witness testimonies, forensic evidence, and his own confessions. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On June 29, 1994, Johann was found deceased in his prison cell, and it was later determined that he had taken his own life. In our number 8 spot today, we have Anthony Sowell. Anthony Sowell was a notorious serial killer whose crimes shocked the city of Cleveland, Ohio from 2007 to 2009. Born on August 19, 1959 in East Cleveland, Sowell's criminal activities targeted vulnerable women, specifically those struggling with addiction and those involved in sex work. Sowell's crimes took place in and around his residence on Imperial Avenue, a seemingly ordinary house that hid a horrifying secret. He would lure his victims to his home under the pretense of offering them something to feed their addictions or shelter. Once inside, his horrifying crimes would unfold. The bodies of his victims were often hidden throughout the house, concealed in various locations, including crawl spaces and buried in the backyard. While these crimes were taking place, the local community was largely unaware of the extent of the crimes occurring in their midst. The victims, many of whom were marginalized and leading transient lives, were often overlooked by society. In October 2009, a courageous survivor managed to escape from Sowell's house and alerted the authorities. When the police executed a search warrant on Sowell's property, they made the horrifying discovery of decomposing bodies, leading to his immediate arrest. The case of Anthony Sowell garnered significant attention within the Cleveland community, where the shock and horror of the crimes reverberated. Local media covered the story extensively, focusing on the heinous nature of the crimes and the impact on the victims' families. However, the case did not receive as much national or international coverage as some other high-profile serial killer cases. During Sowell's trial, the prosecution presented a compelling case against him, supported by physical evidence, DNA matches, and the testimonies of survivors. In 2011, he was found guilty on 82 counts and was sentenced to death. In our number 7 spot today, we have Maury Travis. Maury Travis was an American serial killer who terrorized the St. Louis, Missouri area in the early 2000s. His heinous crimes targeted several women, and he infamously recorded some of the crimes on videotape. In the early 2000s, Travis began a spree of violence that would claim the lives of multiple women, leaving a community on edge and law enforcement agencies frantically searching for answers. It is said that Travis would often lure the young women he targeted either to secluded areas or sometimes even to his own home. Despite the gravity of his actions, Maury Travis' case did not attract widespread media attention beyond the local region. However, the local community was acutely aware of the terror that Travis had unleashed upon their city. Law enforcement agencies diligently investigated the killings, piecing together evidence and connecting the dots to build a case against him. Ultimately, it was the discovery of Travis's collection of graphic and disturbing videos that provided critical evidence linking him to the crimes. On June 30th, 2002, faced with overwhelming evidence against him, Maury Travis took his own life in his jail cell. His death marked the end of a dark chapter in St. Louis's history, but the scars left by his actions remained. Although Maury Travis's case did not receive extensive media coverage outside of the local region, the impact of his crimes on the St. Louis community cannot be understated. In our number 6 6th spot today we have Kendall Francois. Kendall Francois was an American serial killer whose horrific crimes unfolded in the quiet city of Poughkeepsie, New York during the 1990s. Born on July 26, 1971, Francois led a double life, hiding a dark and sinister secret behind his seemingly ordinary facade. Francois specifically targeted women, and he would lure them to his home where he subjected them to unspeakable acts of violence and ultimately took their lives. Shockingly, he managed to conceal his crimes by hiding the bodies of his victims within his residence, creating a haunting and gruesome secret that remained undiscovered for an extended period. Despite the disturbing nature of his crimes, Kendall Francois' case did not receive significant media attention at the time. The lack of widespread coverage was due in part to the marginalized nature of his victims. This made it easier for their disappearances to go unnoticed by the broader public. The true extent of his crimes only came to light in 1998 when a routine visit from police officers, prompted by a complaint about a foul odor, led to the shocking discovery of multiple decomposing bodies hidden throughout his home. In total, the remains of 8 women were found, exposing the gruesome reality of his actions. Kendall Francois was subsequently arrested, and during his trial, the disturbing details of his crimes were revealed. In 2000, he was found guilty on multiple counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. While Kendall Francois' case did not receive the same level of national or international media attention as some other high-profile serial killer cases, it serves as a chilling reminder of the hidden dangers that can lurk within seemingly ordinary communities. In our number 5 spot today, we have Belle Gunness. Belle Gunness was a Norwegian-American serial killer who is believed to have killed over 40 people, including her own family, in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Belle was born in Norway in 1859 and immigrated to the United States in 1881. She settled in Chicago, where she married her first husband and started a family. This was all fine and well until things soon took a turn. Belle began to collect life insurance policies on her family members, and if you're a true crime fan, you likely know where this is going. She then went on to eventually kill them in a fire. She then moved to LaPorte, Indiana, where she purchased a farm and continued to lure wealthy suitors to her property just to then kill them for their money and assets. She was known for her physical strength and was able to bury her victims' bodies on her property. Belle's crimes were discovered in 1908 when a fire destroyed her farm and the remains of several of her victims were found. We love when the villain is brought to justice, but unfortunately that did not happen here. Belle herself was never found, and it is believed that she may have faked her own death and fled the country. In our number 4 spot today, we have Charles Schmid. Charles Schmid, infamously known as the Pied Piper of Tucson, was a figure of terror during the 1960s for his involvement in a string of brutal crimes that shook the city of Tucson, Arizona. Operating between 1964 and 1965, Schmid's first victim, Aline Rowe, disappeared in the fall of 1964. Her disappearance sparked concern among her family and friends, but initially received limited attention from the media. As time went on, his violent tendencies escalated and his list of victims grew. The case gained some attention locally due to the disappearances and the growing sense of unease in Tucson. People were disturbed by the disappearances and the realization that a predator was lurking in their midst. It wasn't until one of Schmid's acquaintances came forward with crucial information that law enforcement finally uncovered the extent of his crimes. In 1965, he was arrested and charged with the killings of Aline Rowe, Gretchen Fritz, and Wendy Fritz. The revelation of his dark secrets shocked the community and brought the nation's attention to the grisly acts committed by the Pied Piper of Tucson. During his trial, the disturbing details of his crimes were exposed, with witnesses testifying to his manipulation, his disregard for human life, and the chilling pleasure he derived from his actions. The case captivated the local media, but it did not achieve the same level of national media coverage as some of the era's more high-profile cases, such as the Manson family. Charles Schmid was found guilty of the killings and sentenced to death. However, in 1972, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment when the death penalty was briefly abolished in the United States. Schmid spent the rest of his life behind bars, becoming a haunting reminder of the evil that can exist within seemingly ordinary individuals. In our number 3 spot today, we have Charles Albright. Charles Albright, famously known as the Eyeball Killer, was a convicted serial killer whose heinous crimes unfolded in Dallas, Texas during the 1990s. Born on August 10, 1933, Albright appeared to lead a relatively normal life. He grew up in a middle-class family, received a good education, and pursued a career in the field of ophthalmology. His chosen profession, specializing in eye care, added a very eerie twist to his later crimes. The hallmark of his crimes was the removal of his victims' eyes, leading to his chilling moniker, the Eyeball Killer. This disturbing signature left a lasting impression on the local community, instilling fear and disbelief in the hearts of those who heard of his deeds. However, this case did not capture the same level of national or even international attention as some other notorious killers of the time. In 1991, Albright's reign of terror came to an end when he was arrested and charged with taking the lives of 3 women, Mary Lou Pratt, Susan Peterson, and Shirley Williams. Albright was convicted of his crimes and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, and he remained incarcerated until his death in 2020. In our number 2 spot today, we have Gary Ray Bowles. Gary Ray Bowles, widely known as the I-95 Killer, was an American serial killer who terrorized the southeastern United States during the early 1990s. His specific targeting of gay men along the Interstate 95 corridor left a trail of fear and devastation in his wake. Despite the gravity of his crimes, Bowles' case did not garner the same level of attention as some other notorious killers of the era. He began his killing spree in March of 1994, spanning over an intense 8-month period. His MO involved targeting vulnerable gay men, often befriending them and gaining their trust before subjecting them to his crimes. This spree would go on to leave a trail of tragedy and heartbreak in multiple states along the I-95 corridor. Bowles' criminal activities finally came to an end in November of 1994 when he was apprehended in Florida. He was subsequently charged with multiple killings, and his capture provided a sense of relief and closure to the affected communities. However, the media attention surrounding his arrest and subsequent trial remained relatively contained. During his trial, the disturbing details of his crimes were revealed, shedding light on the extent of his violence and the tragic loss of innocent lives. Gary Ray Bowles was convicted for 6 killings and received multiple death sentences. He spent years on death row, and his case brought attention to the flaws and complexities of the criminal justice system. In 2019, he died of natural causes while awaiting execution, closing a very dark chapter in the history of serial killers in America. And finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have Cleophas Prince Jr. Cleophas Prince Jr., commonly known as the Claremont Killer, was an American serial killer who operated in the Claremont neighborhood of San Diego, California during the 1990s. Between January and September 1990, Prince embarked on a violent spree targeting and taking the lives of women in the area. Prince would break into their homes or lure them to secluded areas, and while the case did receive attention from local media outlets, the national and international coverage remained relatively limited. Several factors could explain the lack of widespread attention. During the same period, other high-profile serial killer cases, such as those of Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy, dominated the media landscape, diverting attention away from the Cleophas Prince Jr.'s crimes. Additionally, the demographic profile of Prince's victims may have played a role in the limited coverage. It wasn't until September 1990, after an exhaustive investigation and the implementation of advanced forensic techniques, that Cleophas was finally identified as the Claremont Killer. He was arrested and subsequently convicted, ultimately receiving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole.
Number 10. Frank Morris, John and Clarence Anglin. Alcatraz, the famous island prison a little over a mile off the coast of San Francisco, held prisoners including gangsters Al Capone and George Machine Gun Kelly. Among its other famous inmates were brothers John and Clarence Anglin and Frank Morris, who executed an elaborate escape plan. On June 11, 1962, they pulled off one of the greatest prison escapes in American history. After months of planning, they used 3 papier-mâché heads that made them appear to be sleeping as they squeezed through air vents and made their way to the Pacific Ocean, where they boarded a raft they'd made out of stolen raincoats. They were never seen again, and because their raft and paddles washed up ashore, many believe the men drowned in the icy waters. The Anglin family insists the brothers survived and have presented evidence to prove it, and the US Marshal Service has kept the case open in the unlikely event the trio is still alive, according to the FBI. So, did they really escape? No one knows except them. Number 9. Victor Fuerga. On February 6, 1997, Victor Fuerga, a convict serving 1 to 4 years for possession, was supposed to be on the way to the mess hall when he wandered off from the Moria Shock Incarceration Facility, a minimum security prison in Mineville, New York. It was during a routine phone call with his sister, Yvette Cruz, a few days before his alleged escape, that he voiced unrest with his conditions, complaining about a particular guard, and an overall feeling of angst. "There's a guard who keeps messing with me. Look, I have to let you go," Victor shared with his sister before disappearing entirely a few days later. She replied, "Poppy, you know
know I love you. This is going to end in a few months. Please call me tomorrow. But he never did. As soon as his absence was noted, authorities scoured the area, searchers examined the surrounding area, and found footprints leading to a nearby abandoned mine shaft. They assumed that Victor had fled to the mine to avoid detection and fallen to his death. Further pursuit was halted as conditions in the mine were too dangerous for a thorough search to be performed. All anyone knows for sure is that Victor was never seen or heard from again, and he's the only New York State prison inmate to escape and never been found. Number 8. Jerry Bergvin. Records in his thick prison file show that Jerry Bergen's brushes with the law began in the 1940s. In 1962, he was arrested for breaking to a Flint store, pleaded guilty, and was sentenced to 10 to 15 years behind bars on multiple accounts for that burglary and others. Jerry later appealed on a technicality, had trial, and got a reduced sentence. He then wrote letters begging to be transferred from the state prison in Jackson to Camp Waterloo so he could attend dental technician training program there. Wary prison officials expressed concerns about his misconduct in prison, but in April 1969 they agreed to the transfer. The camp housed low-level offenders, and one day he just escaped. Authorities think he may have scaled the barbed wired fence, but it was so long ago that the Michigan Department of Corrections can't say for sure. In 2013, Department of Corrections decided to call off the search for Jerry, who would have been 80 years old at the time, and he's never been found. Number 7. Glenn Stark Chambers. Connie Weeks was a 21-year-old waitress who was the mother of a toddler son at the time she was dating Glenn. On the morning of January 22nd, 1975, the couple had an argument that later spiraled into a physical confrontation. Glenn waited for her outside of her work and her in the parking lot. An off-duty officer intervened and he was arrested. She bailed him out, and later that day, he showed up at the hospital carrying her in his arms. She had severe brain trauma and there was blood found throughout the apartment and in Glenn's vehicle. After 5 days, she was pronounced dead on January 27th. Glenn was convicted of first-degree murder on May 29th, 1975, and on July 11th, he was sentenced to death in the electric chair. On February 21st, 1990, while making office furniture at Florida's Polk Correctional Facility, he convinced other inmates to box him inside a crate and load the crate onto a truck. Somewhere between Polk City and Daytona Beach, Glenn escaped from the back of the truck. When the vehicle did arrive at its destination, his discarded inmate clothing was discovered. Described as intelligent and resourceful, Glenn has family in Minnesota and Florida, and people have reported seeing him in Florida and Alabama, but he is still out there today. Number 6. Glenn Stewart Goodwin. In 1980, Glenn Stewart Goodwin was living in Palm Springs, California, and him and his roommate planned to rob a dealer and pilot Kim Robert LaValle, who was once a friend of theirs. They lured Kim back to their condominium where Glenn punched and kicked him, tried to strangle him, then ultimately stabbed Kim 26 times. After the death, the roommates loaded the body onto a truck and set off for the desert. Glenn tried to blow up the evidence by using homemade explosives strapped to the body. On August 3rd, 1980, some Eagle Mountain residents found a blown-up pickup truck with remains of a human body inside of it abandoned in the desert. Later, police identified the body and charged Glenn with first-degree murder. He was sentenced for the death and robbery to 26 years to life in prison in 1983. In 1987, Glenn escaped the Folsom State Prison in California. He cut a hole through a fence wire and escaped into a storm drain that emptied into the American River. He dropped through a manhole and crawled 750 feet to a raft that he used to float down the river, following painted arrows on rocks that directed him where to go. Later that year, he was arrested for trafficking in Mexico and sent to prison in Guadalajara. In 1991, he allegedly ended the life of a fellow inmate and escaped yet again. He goes by a number of aliases and is believed to be somewhere in Central or South America as of right now, and the FBI is offering a $20,000 reward for information leading to his arrest. Number 5. Omid Nino Tavini. Omid Nino Tavini was a kingpin of an organized crime family in Canada, which is connected to various international crime organizations. From 1999 to 2002, he ran a fraudulent telemarketing business that targeted people in the United States, stealing approximately US $3 million from hundreds of victims, most of them the elderly. By 2003, the RCMP recognized Nino as heading up one of the main criminal organizations operating out of an Iranian community in Canada. He was arrested, and in 2007, while in custody, Nino walked out of a maximum security prison in Canada's British Columbia wearing wearing a janitor's uniform. He had the assistance of a guard whom he bribed to look the other way. The guard, whom Nino never paid, was prosecuted, but Nino remains an international fugitive. He's also wanted in the United States in connection with his fraudulent telemarketing business. In 2017, Nino, who is now almost 40, may have called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to negotiate his return to custody in exchange for a promise to not to extradite him to the United States, but authorities have doubt that the call was credible. Number 4. Vasilis Plikosis. Vasilis Plikosis is a Greek bank robber and fugitive known as the Greek Robin Hood for his habit of giving away stolen money to the poor. He twice escaped by helicopter from a Greek high-security prison while serving a 25-year sentence. He is still free, earning him the nickname of the Uncatchable. While serving a 25-year sentence for kidnapping and robbery, Vasilis managed to escape by helicopter once in 2006 and once in 2009. He hasn't been seen since the 2009 escape, in which he and his cellmate climbed up a rope ladder thrown to them from a helicopter flying over the prison yard. It seems that the helicopter had apparently been hijacked by a woman, and the cellmate was caught, but Vasilis remains at large. The government of Greece faced intense criticism after his second escape from the same facility, and the government responded by firing 3 Justice Ministry officials and arresting 3 prison guards. Vasilis is still at large with a €1 million bounty placed on him for information leading to his arrest, and he could be anywhere in the world. Number 3. George Edward Wright. On Friday, November 23, 1962, the day after Thanksgiving, George Wright and 3 accomplices were involved in the commission of multiple armed robberies. The 4 suspects first robbed the Sands Motel of $200. They then made their way to a gas station, and during the second robbery, they fatally wounded Walter Patterson, a 42-year-old World War II veteran and Bronze Star recipient. Walter later passed away. George was arrested and subsequently sentenced to 15 to 30 years in prison. On August 22, 1970, George first escaped from a New Jersey prison. He was caught and put back into prison only to escape again in 1972. And then he came up with a plan to avoid being re-imprisoned. On July 31, 1972, George and accomplices hijacked a Delta airplane. After collecting ransom and releasing the passengers, George and his crew flew the plane to Algiers. In 2011, the police caught up with him in Portugal, but since Portugal has no extradition treaty with the United States, he was released and remains at large. Number 2. Joanne Deborah Trissimard. Joanne Deborah Trissimard is an American political activist who was a member of the Black Libertarian Army. In 1977, she was convicted in the first-degree murder of State Trooper Werner Forrester during a shootout on the New Jersey Turnpike in 1973. She was sentenced to life in prison, and on November 2, 1979, she escaped with the help of a revolutionary group that she was a member of. She escaped the Clinton Correctional Facility for Women in New Jersey when 3 members of the Black Liberation Army visiting her drew concealed weapons and a stick of dynamite, seized 2 correction officers as hostages, commandeered a van, and made their escape. No one was injured during the prison break, including the officers held hostage who were left in a parking lot. According to later court testimony, she lived in Pittsburgh until August 1980 when she flew to the Bahamas. The FBI continues to offer a $1 million reward for information leading to catching Joanne. She has been living in Cuba, where she was granted political asylum in 1984. And coming in at number 1 is Sharon Kin. Sharon Kin ended the lives of 3 people in the 1960s. The first was her own husband, James Kin, the second, Patricia Jones, the wife of a man whom Sharon was having an affair, and the third was a Mexican-born American citizen whose life was taken in Mexico. She was serving 13 years in a Mexican prison when she escaped on December 7, 1969. She wasn't present for a routine 5 p.m. roll call, and her absence was not officially noted until she also failed to show up at a second roll call later that evening. A manhunt was then arranged, initially focusing on northern Mexican states due to authorities' belief that Sharon may have been heading for the last known whereabouts of a former inmate whom she had grown close to while they were in prison together. The search also encompassed countrywide transport hubs and eventually circled back to the Mexico City area. U.S. authorities, including the FBI, were also alerted of the Mexican authorities' beliefs that Sharon may have attempted to work her way back into her native country. As of 2022, she is the subject of the longest currently outstanding arrest warrant for murder in the history of Kansas City, Missouri, and one of the longest outstanding felony warrants in U.S. history.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Jason Barnum. Jason Barnum, also known as Eyeball due to his tattooed right eye, is a figure who has gained notoriety for his life of crime and distinctive appearance. Born in Alaska, Barnum's life took a dark dark turn as he succumbed to a struggle with addiction and criminal activities. In 2012, Barnum's life of crime culminated in a series of events that would land him in a maximum security prison. He was involved in a string of burglaries, car thefts, and a shooting incident with the police that left an officer injured. His actions during this crime spree demonstrated a dangerous disregard for human life and the law. During his court proceedings, the judge, while acknowledging Barnum's difficult upbringing and struggles with addiction, sentenced him to 22 years in prison for his crimes. In our number 9 spot today, we have Alexander Pichushkin. Alexander Pichushkin is a figure of terror known by the spine-chilling epithet, the chessboard killer. His goal, as horrifying as it was unique, was to take a life for each space on a chessboard, a total of 64 individuals. This chilling ambition set him apart from other criminals and made him a feared figure not only in his operating base of Moscow, but also around the world. Alexander's reign of terror was marked by a level of brutality that left a trail of carnage in his wake. His victims were not merely killed, they were subjected to violent deaths that really showed the depth of his ruthlessness. The authorities eventually convicted him for 48 killings, however, Pichushkin himself claims a higher count, insisting that his total stands at 60 victims. Whether this claim is the truth or an attempt to inflate his notoriety remains uncertain. What is clear, however, is that the sheer scale of his crimes, coupled with his terrifying goal, makes him a figure of dread. His chilling ambition and the brutal reality of his crimes make Alexander Pichushkin a prisoner whose release would be a nightmare come true. In our number 8 spot today, we have Richard Lee McNair. Richard Lee McNair is a name that has become synonymous with cunning escapes and audacious evasion. Convicted for killering and burglary in the 80s, McNair's story took a turn for the extraordinary when he demonstrated a knack for escaping prison. Not once, but 3 times. His most infamous escape was from a maximum security prison in Louisiana in 2006. In a plot that seemed straight out of a Hollywood movie, McNair slipped out of the prison work detail by mailing himself out of the prison in a crate. Once outside, he managed to evade capture for over a year, leading authorities on a nationwide manhunt. McNair's ability to charm and deceive, coupled with his physical fitness, made him a formidable fugitive. His escapes and subsequent recaptures were widely covered in the media, earning him a reputation as a real-life escape artist. Finally captured in Canada in 2007, McNair is now held in the Supermax prison ADX Florence in Colorado. His story serves as a chilling reminder of the lengths some prisoners will go to regain their freedom. Richard Lee McNair is undoubtedly a figure you pray never escapes again. In our number 7 spot today, we have Terry Nichols. Terry Nichols is a name that sends chills down the spine of anyone familiar with the horrific Oklahoma City bombing. Nichols, along with his accomplice Timothy McVeigh, orchestrated one of the deadliest acts of domestic terrorism in U.S. history. On April 19, 1995, a truck exploded outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, killing 168 people and injuring hundreds more. Nichols, a former army buddy of McVeigh's, was deeply involved in the planning and preparation of the attack. His anti-government sentiments and extremist beliefs fueled his participation in this act of terror. Following the attack, Nichols was quickly apprehended and brought to justice. In a trial that gripped the nation, Nichols was convicted of conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction, as well as other charges relating to the seriousness of his crimes. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole and is currently held in the ADX Florence maximum security prison in Colorado, the same one we just talked about. In our number 6 spot today, we have Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway is a name that evokes a chilling sense of dread and is notoriously known as the Green River Killer. This ominous moniker stems from his gruesome modus operandi, which involved leaving the bodies of his victims along the Green River in Washington. The river, once a symbol of natural beauty, became a grim reminder of Ridgway's merciless killing spree. Ridgway's crimes were not sporadic instances of violence, but a series of premeditated killings that made him one of the most prolific serial killers in history. Officially, he was convicted of 49 crimes, but the actual number of his victims is believed to be at least double that count. What made Ridgway even more terrifying was not just the scale of his crimes, but also his attitude towards them. In a chilling display of lack of empathy, Ridgway confessed his crimes without any visible signs of emotion or remorse. This cold-blooded confession provided a terrifying insight into the mind of a remorseless killer, revealing a man devoid of any empathy or guilt for his heinous actions. The enormity of his crimes, coupled with his emotionless demeanor, makes Gary Ridgway a prisoner whose release would be a horrifying prospect. His chilling legacy continues to haunt those familiar with his story, making him a figure whose freedom is preyed against. In our number 5 spot today, we have Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader is more widely recognized by his chilling moniker BTK, an abbreviation which disturbingly describes his preferred method of killing. Rader's reign of terror spanned over 17 years in Wichita, Kansas, a time during which he took a perverse pleasure in his horrific acts, savoring the terror he instilled in the hearts of residents. Rader wasn't merely a man who committed heinous crimes, he was a sadist who reveled in his victims' suffering and the dread he inspired. His chilling letters to the police, where he arrogantly flaunted his crimes, added an extra layer of psychological terror to his spree. The letters served as a chilling reminder of his presence, keeping the community in a constant state of fear and uncertainty. These communications revealed a deeply disturbed mind, one that was not just content with the physical act of his horrific crimes, but also sought to manipulate and terrorize an entire community. Rader's pleasure in his cruel actions, his taunting letters, and the psychological torment he subjected Wichita to make the thought of this man walking free a very unsettling prospect, and one that will probably never come true, thankfully. In our number 4 spot today, we have Cleophas Prince Jr. In the shadowy realm of San Diego's suburban streets lurked a menacing phantom during the 1990s. Cleophas Prince Jr., at the time known as the Claremont Killer, turned the 90s into a real-life horror show. Over 9 dreadful months, he embarked on a relentless hunt, marking women as his prey in the seemingly serene Claremont neighborhood. To do this, he would either break into their homes when they least expected it, or sweet-talk them into some quiet, out-of-the-way spot. During his reign of terror, while the local news was all over it, the rest of the world hardly blinked. During this time, the stage of national and international press was captivated by other monstrous players such as Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy, which casted a horrific shadow that eclipsed the terrifying exploits of Cleophas. Thankfully, however, in September 1990, thanks to some top-notch detective work and breakthroughs in forensic science, they finally pinned the tail on the donkey. Cleophas Prince Jr., Mr. Claremont Killer himself, got nabbed. The courts threw the book at him, and now he is chilling behind bars for the rest of his days. No parole, no second chances. In our number 3 spot today, we have Pedro Rodrigues Filho. Also known as the Padrino Matador, he is a Brazilian serial killer who is believed to have killed over 70 people, mostly other criminals, in the 1960s and the 1970s. He had a very difficult childhood, as his father was a notorious criminal who actually really sadly harmed and killed his mother, and this of course had a profound influence on Pedro and his life. This experience is believed to have contributed to his violent behavior later in life. Pedro began his crime spree at a super young age, and he started with a horrific crime when he killed the vice mayor of his town, who he believed was responsible for the death of his girlfriend. He continued to kill other criminals, often targeting those who had previously wronged him or his family. Pedro was arrested in 1973 and was eventually convicted of killing 71 people. He is currently serving a prison sentence in Brazil and is known for his outspoken and unrepentant attitude towards his crimes. While I am sure we can all feel sympathy for the things that Pedro experienced in life, it truly is no excuse for the things that he chose to do. In our number 2 spot today, we have Charles Ng. Charles Ng is a name that will send chills down the spine, and he was a key player in the reign of terror that unfolded in the 1980s. Alongside his equally terrifying accomplice, Leonard Lake, Ng played a significant role in a series of crimes that remain etched into the annals of criminal history for their sheer depravity and cruelty. The grim saga began when Ng and Lake joined forces to unleash a wave of horror that would haunt their victims and the public alike. Their modus operandi was chilling. Unsuspecting individuals would be lured into their grasp only to be subjected to unimaginable torture, their final moments filled with fear and agony. What made their reign of terror even more horrifying was the duo's penchant for recording their despicable acts. These videos served as a chilling testament to their inhumanity, a grotesque spectacle of their victims suffering under their hands. Ng's role in these crimes was not that of a mere spectator, he was a very active participant, his cold-blooded nature making making him a figure of dread. This, combined with his seeming indifference to the pain and suffering of his victims, made him one of the most feared inmates in the prison system. His heinous acts have left a dark stain on his name, making Charles Ng a prisoner that many pray to never see free again. And finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, a figure shrouded in infamy and widely recognized by his chilling moniker, the Son of Sam. He struck fear into the heart of New York City in the late 1970s. His name became synonymous with a wave of terror that swept through the city as he embarked on a series of shootings that left the public in a state of constant fear and uncertainty. Berkowitz's crimes were not random acts of violence. They were methodically planned and executed with a chilling precision that left the authorities baffled and the public on edge. Each attack added to the growing panic, creating an atmosphere of dread that permeated the city. But it wasn't just his crimes that made Berkowitz a figure of terror. His claims of demonic possession added a layer of horror to his already frightening persona. These claims, whether true or the product of a deranged mind, painted a picture of a man under the influence of dark forces, making him an even more unsettling figure. The combination of his heinous crimes, alleged demonic possession, and erratic behavior made him a prisoner that one would fervently pray never walks free again. Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have John George Haigh. John George Haigh, commonly referred to as the acid bath killer, was an infamous English serial killer who operated in the 1940s. His gruesome crimes shocked the nation and earned him a chilling reputation for his method of disposing of the victims' bodies, which involved dissolving them in sulfuric acid. His victims included both men and women whom he targeted for their money and possessions. Haigh would befriend his victims, gaining their trust before luring them to his place of work, a warehouse located in Crawley, West Sussex. Haigh believed that if there were no physical remains, the police would have no evidence of his crimes. However, his assumption proved to be flawed. What a shocker. Police investigators found that while the acid effectively destroyed most of the victims' bodies, certain remains such as dentures, bone fragments, and other non-organic materials were resistant to the corrosive effects. Eventually, Haigh's crimes caught up with him. In 1949, he was arrested for the killing of a wealthy man named Archibald Henderson, whose disappearance had raised suspicions. During his interrogation, Haigh confessed not only to killing Henderson, but also several other individuals. At his trial, Haigh's sanity became a significant point of contention. He claimed that he was driven by a compulsion to drink human blood and that he believed he could turn his victims' bodies into sludge, allowing him to absorb their wealth. Despite these claims, the court found Haigh guilty and he was sentenced to death. On August 10, 1949, John George Haigh was executed by hanging at Wandsworth Prison in London. In our number 9 spot today, we have Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez. Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez, notorious as the Lonely Hearts Killers, were a criminal couple who operated in the late 1940s. Using various aliases and personas, Fernandez would respond to Lonely Hearts ads placed by women seeking love or companionship. He would pose as a charming, attractive man, enticing these women into romantic relationships. Beck, playing the role of Fernandez's sister or relative, would eventually join the relationship, gaining the trust of the victims. Once the couple had gained the woman's trust and manipulated them emotionally, they would proceed to rob them of their money, possessions, and even their personal savings. In some cases, the victims' bank accounts would be emptied and their properties sold off. As their greed and desperation increased, the couple turned to killing in order to eliminate any potential witnesses who could expose their criminal activities. Their crimes eventually caught up with them when they targeted a widow named Janet Fay in 1949. Fay's sister became suspicious of Fernandez's intentions and alerted the authorities. The couple was apprehended in Michigan and extradited to New York for trial. During the trial, Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez confessed to multiple crimes. Both Beck and Fernandez were found guilty and sentenced to death. On March 8, 1951, Martha Beck was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing Correctional Facility. Raymond Fernandez met the same fate on the same day. In our number 8 spot today, we have Charles Sabraj. Infamously known as the Bikini Killer or the Serpent, was a serial killer active during the 1970s who targeted and preyed upon Western tourists traveling through South Asia. He would approach them, often posing as a gem dealer or an official guiding guiding them through the region. Once he had gained their trust, he would employ various methods to incapacitate and then take the life of his victims. These methods included poisoning, using intoxicating substances, and sometimes even more violent physical methods. He would then rob them of their belongings, including money, passports, and any valuable possessions. Despite being arrested multiple times, he demonstrated remarkable skills in manipulating the legal systems of various countries. He often managed to escape from custody either through bribery, forging documents, or exploiting legal loopholes. However, his luck eventually ran out. In 1976, while attempting to poison a group of French students in New Delhi, he was arrested by authorities. In 1977, he was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment in India. Over the years, he faced additional legal troubles in countries like Thailand and Nepal, which further extended his time behind bars. In our number 7 spot today, we have Gary Haigh. This is a name you might be more familiar with than some of the others on this list, and that is because this is the man who inspired the character of Buffalo Bill in the infamous novel Silence of the Lambs. If you're familiar with the literature, you'll know that that's absolutely not a good sign. Gary Haigh was an American serial killer who committed heinous crimes in the late 1980s. Haigh kidnapped and tormented 6 women, imprisoning them in his home. He would lure them into his home under false pretenses, offering food, shelter, or something else that they needed or wanted. Once inside, he subjected them to unimaginable horrors, imprisoning them in a pit dug in the basement of his house, which was later named the Pit of Horrors. Of course, I cannot detail much more of his crimes in order to stay within the guidelines of YouTube, but it's safe to say it was absolutely horrendous. Tragically, 2 of Heigh's victims did not survive the ordeal. The remains of Deborah Dudley and Sandra Lindsay were discovered in Heigh's basement, leading to his arrest in March 1987. The remaining 4 women were rescued and provided critical testimony against him. During his trial, Heigh's disturbing and psychopathic behavior became very apparent. He displayed no remorse for his actions and even attempted to act as his own attorney. His behavior and erratic courtroom antics added to the shock and horror surrounding the case. Ultimately, he was found guilty of multiple counts of killing and many other charges as well. He was sentenced to death and spent several years on death row while his case went through numerous appeals. On July 6, 1999, Gary Haigh was executed by lethal injection at the State Correctional Institute in Rockview, Pennsylvania. In our number 6 spot today, we have Yang Xinhai. Yang, also known as the Monster Killer, was one of the most prolific serial killers in China's history. Active from 1999 to 2003, he terrorized multiple provinces by taking the lives of his victims, often targeting entire families. Yang's heinous crimes shocked the nation and left a lasting impact on Chinese society. In 1988, at the age of 20, Yang embarked on his life of crime. He was arrested and imprisoned for a series of burglaries, spending time in a labor camp. Following his release in 1999, he began a spree of violence that would terrify communities throughout China. Yang's MO involved breaking into houses during the night, often in rural areas where security was relatively lax. He would then kill the occupants, and he showed no mercy or remorse. The brutality and frequency of Yang's crimes were unprecedented in China. He showed a complete disregard for human life, often leaving behind scenes of extreme violence and horror. Despite the high number of killings, Yang managed to evade capture for several years. However, in November 2003, Yang's killing spree came to an end. During a routine police inspection, he was caught in the act of committing a burglary. When questioned by the police, Yang confessed. During his trial, he showed no remorse for his actions and appeared detached from the gravity of his crimes. He was found guilty, and in February 2004, Yang was sentenced to death and executed soon after. In our number 5 spot today, we have Pedro Rodrigues Filho. Also known as the Padrino Matador, he is a Brazilian serial killer who is believed to have killed over 70 people, mostly other criminals, in the 1960s and 1970s. Pedro had a difficult childhood as his father was a notorious criminal who actually really sadly harmed and killed his mother. This of course had a profound influence on Pedro and his life. This experience is believed to have contributed to his violent behavior later on. Pedro began his crime spree at a super young age, and he started with a horrific crime when he killed the vice mayor of his town, who he believed was responsible for the death of his girlfriend. He continued to kill other criminals, often targeting those who had previously wronged him or his family. Pedro was arrested in 1973 and was eventually convicted of killing 71 people. Although he was sentenced to 400 years, there was a maximum time of 30 years, which Pedro served before being released in 2007. Pedro himself passed away earlier this year in March after being killed by 2 still unknown suspects. In our number 4 spot today, we have Karl Panzram. Karl Panzram was a notorious criminal and serial killer who committed a wide range of heinous acts during the early 20th century. In his own written account, Panzram claimed responsibility for 21 killings and thousands of burglaries. Throughout his criminal career, he traveled extensively, committing a slew of violent crimes along the way. This geographical dispersion made it difficult for law enforcement to connect his crimes and build a comprehensive profile of his actions. He targeted individuals who he perceived as easy victims, often taking advantage of their vulnerability or luring them into isolated areas. In 1928, Panzram was apprehended and arrested for burglary. While in prison, he authored an autobiography in which he provided a chilling first-hand account of his crimes and his deeply antisocial mindset. Panzram's writings offered a disturbing glimpse into the mind of a remorseless and violent individual. On September 5, 1930, Panzram was executed by hanging at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas. His execution marked the end of his violent reign, but his written confessions and personal accounts continue to fascinate and disturb those interested in the psychology of criminal behavior. In our number 3 spot today, we have Stephen Richards. Stephen Richards, also known by his alias Captain Moonlight, is a notorious figure in Australian criminal history. Before adopting his criminal persona, Richards pursued a career as a lay preacher in the Anglican Church. However, his actions were not in line with his religious calling. He engaged in fraudulent activities, including embezzlement and insurance scams, which led to his imprisonment in 1869. During his time in prison, Richards met another criminal named Jesse Nesbitt, and together they formed a bond. Upon their release in 1874, Richards and Nesbitt began leading a gang that engaged in robberies and confrontations with law enforcement. Richards adopted the moniker Captain Moonlight as his alias, and his charismatic personality garnered attention from both the public and the media. He cultivated an image of a romanticized outlaw, drawing inspiration from the legends of American Old West figures like Jesse James and Ned Kelly. In 1879, the gang attempted to rob a bank in New South Wales, resulting in a violent shootout. Several members of the gang, including Nesbitt, were killed, and Richards was captured along with the remaining members. Following their capture, Richards and his surviving gang members were put on trial for killing. The prosecution argued that Richards had ordered the shooting of a police officer during the failed bank robbery. Despite his claims of innocence, Richards was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. In the early morning hours of January 20th, 1880, Stephen Richards met his fate on the gallows at Darlinghurst Gaol in Sydney. In our number 2 spot today, we have Thomas Neil Cream. What a horrible name. So bad. Thomas Cream, dubbed the Lambeth Poisoner, was a Scottish-Canadian doctor who gained notoriety for his terrifying activities during the late 19th century. Cream's preferred method of killing was poisoning, and he targeted his victims, particularly women with whom he had been romantically involved. His crime spree started to crumble after the death of a woman named Matilda Clover, who had been his lover. Suspicion arose regarding her sudden demise, and an investigation was launched, and evidence pointed toward Cream's involvement. However, lacking concrete proof, authorities were unable to bring charges against him. Cream, undeterred, continued his killing spree, but his luck would soon run out. In 1892, Cream's crimes were exposed when he implicated himself in a series of poisonings in a bid to frame others for the killings. His actions drew attention, leading to his arrest and subsequent trial. During the trial, Cream made several erratic outbursts, including accusing others of being the true culprits, but to no avail. In October 1892, Thomas Neil Cream was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. On November 15, 1892, he met his fate at Newgate Prison in London. In our number 1 spot today, we have Andrei Chikatilo. Andrei, infamously known as the Butcher of Rostov, was a Soviet serial killer who terrorized Russia for over a decade. Operating between 1978 and 1990, Chikatilo was responsible for taking the lives of at least 53 people, predominantly young and vulnerable individuals. His MO typically involved approaching his victims under the pretense of offering assistance, promising them employment, or personal favors. Once he gained their trust, he would then lead them to a secluded location where the horrors would take place. In 1990, his crimes were finally brought to an end. A series of coincidences and the persistence of an investigator named Viktor Burakov led to his identification and subsequent arrest. Despite his initial denial of the crimes, DNA evidence eventually linked him to them, leading to his confession. During his trial in 1992, he was found guilty of 53 killings, although he later claimed to have killed more than 100 victims. Chikatilo was sentenced to death and executed on February 14, 1994.